Hi, welcome to Freelance Founders, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I'm Rae Hames. I'm an agency expat, a brand side leader, and former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Say hi, Nick.
How's it going?
And Nick is a career freelance creative turned freelance coach. We're here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope our listeners will find something in here that helps them smooth out the bumps along the road working with and as freelancers.
And if you have any feedback, insights, questions, or would just like to join us on a future episode, drop us a DM. So let's get into it. Today is our very first episode, and we figured we might as well start from the top. So today we're going to be talking about finding and onboarding freelancers. So the first question is where to find the right freelancer. Rae, you've hired freelancers in a bunch of different capacities throughout your career, and you even built a freelance-focused recruiting company before your current startup. So the question here is, where are your go-to sources for finding freelancers?
I think that this is a question that comes up a lot. When you talk about freelance pain points, hiring and finding the right people is always the first one. In my experience, and again, I've worked at big agencies, at small agencies, I've been at brand side. In almost every scenario, freelancers were hired through word of mouth. So it was always, I've been in creative teams, I've been in production teams, and it's always a creative director saying, I've got somebody that I've worked with in the past. Let me call them up and see if they're available. Oh, they're not available, but they referred me to somebody who is. And so I think that for the most part, that's been my experience. As I started scaling a real freelance network with my last company and really became focused on freelance recruiting, I definitely had to broaden the horizons behind, getting outside of my own personal connection bubble. And I think that, there's a few marketplaces out there that are higher quality than others. I think the ones that we had the best luck with was probably Working Not Working. It can be a really high quality resource, but it really is dependent on freelancers who are on that platform keeping their information up to date. So you'd start seeing an amazing profile and realize that the last time they updated it was 2017. And so it starts to become irrelevant pretty quickly. And certainly when I was in more of a recruiting seat, I really just used LinkedIn Jobs. You kind of hire for longer term contract roles, just like you do full-time roles. You're just really clear and transparent about it being a contract-based position. It's not the same thing for kind of more short-term one-off projects, like looking for a photographer for a weekend shoot. But for the most part, those Working Not Working and LinkedIn were the two highest quality sources that I had when I was hiring at a bigger scale than just kind of one-by-one roles. You've freelanced for years now. I'm curious to know where do you find work?
Yeah, I think my journey has been pretty similar in that it's mostly a personal network that doesn't necessarily come from LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn has more so been a tool to kind of like continue to build the personal network. So while I wouldn't consider that necessarily the network itself, I think it's been a way to grow the network and kind of like maintain relationships that maybe start on LinkedIn and then I bring into more in-person meetings or vice versa. And I also think it's interesting that you bring up Working Not Working because I've heard that those platforms have worked for others, but it seems to be a little more one-off kind of situations where certain people seem to really attach themselves to one specific platform. But as a whole, I think I've seen the networking side of it kind of be the thing that is where most freelancers end up finding the majority of their work.
It's interesting. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on all of the marketplaces, and there is a very broad range of quality. Like I call it thrift store shopping because there's a lot of garbage you need to sift through, but you can totally find gems. And I also have worked with people who are really dedicated to a single platform. And I think it's because the back-end logistics, Upwork, Fiverr, all of those big ones are charging a pretty big cut of freelance rates to be on their platform. That's how the platforms themselves are making money. And the more work you take on, the higher rank you'll be served up in rankings. It has to do with their internal rating system. And so there are people I know that really focus on, like you said, like, let's say I'm an Upwork graphic designer, because if they're getting a high volume of projects through a single platform and getting decent ratings, they're going to keep showing up in search results, and that volume is going to probably be enough to sustain them. It's a really interesting dynamic. I think that we could probably spend this whole session talking about marketplace dynamics.
Absolutely.
Because I think it works in different ways for whether you're looking for a freelancer or a freelancer yourself on those platforms, but in a similar way where, you know, you kind of get hooked into one, and it's not the quality of talent that's keeping you there, the quality of projects that are keeping you there, but certainly the back end logistics are probably taken care of, you know, on some level.
Yeah, it seems like there's always pros and cons, right? Like for me, I tried Upwork a little bit just to kind of get a feeling for understanding how the platform worked and like what the benefit of being on there was, just because as I kind of position myself into more of this coaching space and try and help creatives that are earlier in their journey get to where they want to go, that can be a very attractive tool for someone who's starting out and who is really trying to get their feet wet with more client relationships and how to do a lot of that while having a lot of the logistical stuff taken care of. But yeah, it does seem to be that with a lot of these other external platforms, it's more dependent on where you're at in your journey and what you kind of need and how that fits into your needs versus kind of going off more on your own and trusting more of your network.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true. And I think kind of no matter where you're looking for work, a really important piece of the puzzle is having the right project brief or the right type of job description. I know that that's always been it's a real pain point on both sides. Having to write a job description is real work, and having to parse through, a brief and try to figure out what people are asking for is also like a mental gymnastics. What does a good brief look like to you, and how can it help you decide if the job's going to be a good fit for you?
Absolutely. I think for the longest time, I got really attracted to a lot of the fluff that would come out of these. And I think that's where we've seen the industry as a whole kind of shift is like you used to be able to talk about the culture a little more. And that would attract a lot of people because when we were all traditionally more in that 9 to 5 environment, it was like, well, I want to make sure that everything around me and the environment that I'm going to be in is going to be something that I want to be a part of. And I think the industry as a whole didn't really see the shift happening toward more of this freelance stuff. And so I think there's still a lot of the fluff happening in those briefs to try and, cater to your creative mind where you're like, wow, what a wonderful environment this is going to be. But I think once you can kind of get beyond that, what I tend to look for is a little more honesty. Like, what are the actual difficulties that are going to be associated with the role? So instead of saying, we need someone to come in and, be a part of the culture fit and all of this, it's kind of getting a little more to the point of like, this is what we need you to do. And these are going to be the real things that you have a hard time with and why we're hiring for this job and knowing the truth behind what those actually are. And then kind of bleeding into more of the integrity kind of thing. Like, what are the company goals and how does that resonate with what work I want to do and how I might fit in? So I think it tends to be 1, honesty, 2, integrity, and then 3, like, how does my role specifically fit into that system? Because I think the mix of those 3 gives you a better understanding of more transparency within the company and the fact that they actually know what they're hiring for. I think a lot of times with some of these roles, you can get into a rock and a hard place with the role was mentioned being a specific thing. And the second you get in, it feels like almost a bait and switch of like, well, we actually need you to do this. So that's kind of what I try and sift through when I'm looking through the briefs is like, do they know what the real issue is that they're trying to solve for?
What I think is really interesting on that front as well is just the fact that inherently, as a freelancer, you're coming in on a fixed term, right? You're saying, I'm going to be, whether I'm here for a week or 6 months or 18 months, I'm here to provide an outcome, right? Like I'm here to provide a specific skill that isn't part of your full-time workforce, and that you need to get a project done. So what does that project look like? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's interesting that you talk about kind of like the culture fluff side of things, because if I'm hiring freelancers, that culture piece is way less relevant, especially if they're off-site. But that's way less relevant than is the quality of their work going to perform the way we need it to perform? Is it? I think more and more companies are trying to figure out ways to like meaningfully manage to outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so much, as a freelancer, you can't just come in and show up and shoot the shit and be a fun coworker and leave, without contributing anything, because that's not the nature of your relationship with the company that you're working for. And I think that that's a really honest space to be in. That's like why I loved freelancing myself and why I think that more and more people are attracted to it, because
Mm-hmm.
if you're good at what you do, you can be good at what you do in multiple instances. People can appreciate you for the work and the expertise that you bring. And you don't have to spend a lot of energy on the pieces of the dynamic around it. So it's interesting. I mean, I just think that that's an interesting angle as well to think about it from a job description perspective, being really crisp on what you expect a freelancer to come in with, to be prepared with, to build, or create, and like that being the rubric for success.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. It gets off into a completely different topic that we'll have to talk about at some point, which is, working more with the millennial generation and what they expect out of a role. And I think that kind of goes pretty easily into that that kind of topic. And it's like, I think where things went for the longest time was it seemed like no one on either side of the fence could really be honest about what actually needed to be done. And so a lot of that fluff stuff came out of, well, we're not going to talk really about what you could do better or what we really need you to work on. So we're going to go focus on all of this other culture stuff to kind of make you feel like you're okay with being in this environment.
Right.
And I think where things shifted on both ends now is wanting more transparency and wanting to get more clarity on like, what are we actually solving for, and how do we make sure that both on the freelancer end and the business end that we're working toward the same outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there was a time where it was like, we just need more hands.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, well, what do you want these hands to do?
Yep. And that kind of goes into like what you see with a lot of the big tech companies too, where there's a lot of kind of massive onboarding, and then eventually they realize, oh, whoops, we crossed the threshold, time to jettison all of those people that we've had on. And I think that's always been the frustration on a freelancer's end, is like, how long are we in this environment based on what the company goals are that we're not necessarily privy to?
Right. And that if we collectively aren't being, managed in a cohesive way, we can't have any control over anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned onboarding.
Yep, that's where I was going to go. So on that topic, once you've kind of figured out who to hire, onboarding is kind of the next piece. So I know this can be done in a million different ways and every company is different, but for you, Rae, what are the most common onboarding scenarios that you've seen?
I think that the term onboarding can mean something different to everybody, and certainly to every different department. So there's legal onboarding, which is like, you're a freelancer, send me your 1099. I need to get you in our system as a contractor. There's like resource hub onboarding, which tools do you need access to? Here's, are you a big company? Are you using like an Okta sign in? Do you need a company email to be able to do that? Like contractor provisioning is the technical term around that, where
Sounds fun.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's right next to procurement. But certainly there's legal onboarding, HR, if HR is involved, at that time. There's resource onboarding, like getting you up to speed. Here's where you track your time. And then there's interpersonal, like team onboarding and bonding. So I think that that's the most important one, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think that the legal and HR onboarding, that it's how long is a piece of string. How big is your company is how long that process is going to be. I've been onboarded in 30 minutes, and I've been onboarded across like 4 days, like 4 business days. And it just depends on how many different departments need to sign off on your contract and how many different systems are in place. And it can, again, that really varies company to company. And the most meaningful piece of onboarding is going to happen with the team that you're working with. Like, who is the team lead that you're going to be reporting into? Who are your partners on the team that you're going to be collaborating with? And getting to know, I mean, there's functional pieces, right? It's like, are you a fully remote team? How are you communicating? Are you a Slack team? Are you a video team? Are you a phone call team? Like, yikes. Personally. And getting to know how a team's really going to benefit from your skill set is the other. It's a two-way street. I think that we've seen some really amazing onboarding programs that bring contractors in where everybody has, like each hiring manager has a user manual that explains, here's what I'm like, just on paper. I know this about myself. Here's what I want for my team. Here's how I look at my team, to gauge success. And what that requires is real self-reflection and self-knowledge on the manager's part. But what it provides is a really crystal clear outline for anybody coming into this team is saying, okay, Rae doesn't like if you text her, it better be an emergency. Don't panic her with a phone call. She is going to give her most thoughtful feedback via email because she's a scatterbrain in Slack, but she's great at emojis. So if you want an LOL, hit her up. It's like, that's totally, all of this is just being human and being self-aware, but it sets your team up for success in those early days of like, who I just dropped myself into a team. Who are all these people around me?
Yep.
So I think that that's a thing that in kind of the best run teams I've really appreciated. And then just kind of having a set, stages of check-ins. If you're working on a project that's 6 months long, it makes sense that your onboarding is going to take a whole month. Hey, you're going to spend a couple weeks bumping around, getting your arms around the idea of a project, figuring out your systems, getting a historical context, being in meetings you may or may not need to be in. That's just the reality of it,
Yep.
But then as you go on, it makes sense to have some check-ins built in to say, okay, Nick, we just started a project 3 weeks ago. How are you doing? Are there any major roadblocks? Are you having sticking points that I can help unblock? I think a smart manager is building those into their onboarding timeline, just like they would with a full-time employee, maybe on a compressed time scale and maybe with slightly different questions. But ultimately the onus is on the manager to proactively plan around that so that the freelancers that are coming in and out of the fold can come in, do great work, and not have to focus on it's time for my review or it's time for a check-in. I feel like that should be a management responsibility, personally. I know that we've worked on a handful of projects together, and you've always been super proactive in like finding ways to get your head around a project. From where you sit, what do you think freelancers should know about asking the right questions to get themselves kind of set up for success on day one?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's pretty much everything that you just outlined, because I think the difficulty that I've experienced on my end with being a freelancer and coming through what other companies kind of consider onboarding is it feels a lot more just like an HR check mark of like, we gave you this file, done. We got you in this system, done. It feels less like we're trying to get you set up for success in your position and more like this is just an internal check mark to kind of cross our T's and dot our I's legally. So I think from my perspective, what I picked up on was trying to kind of touch on a little more of those intangibles of exactly what you talked about, which is like, how do I work well with different team members? Who is someone that needs to be communicated with in a different way? Where are typical pain points coming up in maybe handing off a brief to a different team or working with a different department? What managers feel like they maybe are brought in too much versus not enough. A lot more of like the kind of interpersonal stuff that goes on that leads to the work being done better. I think too many times in those environments, everyone as a whole kind of tends to push off the personal stuff a little more. And to me, that's always been the thing that kind of leads to better work, is making sure that you're collaborating more efficiently and effectively with the people around you. So I always kind of say just the more questions, the better. And I usually try and soften the blow a little bit with just saying up front, like, hey, I'm probably going to be really annoying for like the first month because I'm literally going to ask you more questions than your head can handle. And it's because I'm trying to pick up on all of these different dynamics of like, if this thing comes up, how do I work through it without making people frustrated so that we can all kind of keep going and working on the same thing together. So long story short, I think it's more about how do you find common ground and just establish the relationships and just ask as many questions as you can to kind of chip away at those things.
Yeah. And I think that that's a big piece of maturity. It's a big sign of maturity that when you can ask for help or you can ask for guidance and not feel like you need to have all the answers. I know, we've all been in our early 20s and feeling like, I better keep my mouth shut. If I can't figure this answer out, they're going to fire me, and it's actually, the dynamics are actually the opposite, where the more questions you ask, it shows that you're engaged in the project. And also, nobody can tell you what you need to know about a project other than you, right? Like, you know where the gaps are in your understanding of an assignment, and you have to be able to ask the pointed questions to fill in those gaps in a way that makes sense for you. I'll caveat that to like any juniors out there, like if it's Googleable, Google it. But
it's funny that you have to mention that, but honestly, yeah, I think that's huge. It's like we spend so much time on these apps looking at kind of junk content, but there's so many simple concepts out there that I think can go such a long way in some of these environments that people just don't necessarily pay attention to.
Yeah, it's not about asking every question that pops in your head. It's about asking questions that you genuinely can't answer for yourself.
Yes, and I think also establishing that that's who you are from the jump, because I think what happens oftentimes when you're talking about people being scared to kind of bring certain things to their manager's attention, I think that comes from a position of not having established themselves as asking the hard questions to work through that in the first place. And so if they haven't asked those questions for a really long time, and then all of a sudden they're bringing up a really hard thing out of nowhere, in any relationship, that's going to start to get difficult. So I think the more you can kind of set yourself up for success at the beginning and show that you're willing to work through that up front with small things, it means it's a lot less difficult when the big stuff comes up.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. Definitely, like laying the right groundwork is a big factor for success on both sides. Again, it goes back to how well did you write the job description? How well did you write the brief? How well did you bring yourself, how informed did you bring yourself to this project to contribute? And like you said, introduce yourself to your new manager and your new team as a person who is going to be, poking at the edges to make sure that you can do your best work, because that's ultimately what this is all in service of.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, good chat. I think this is all of our time for today. What a fun first episode.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, if you found this useful, or not, follow us here. Follow us over on LinkedIn. Nick and I are both sharing tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelance talent. And we will see you next time on Freelance Frontiers.